Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this IT governance flash briefing on security testing. This webinar is going to be delivered by James Pickard, Senior Penetration Testing Manager, but unfortunately at the last minute he had a personal issue which has meant that you have me instead. I hope that you will nevertheless find it interesting and enjoyable. For those of you who don't know about IT governance, we have 15 years in the world of cybersecurity, more than 12,000 customers spread across 6 continents, depending on how you count continents, obviously. We specialize in IT governance risk and compliance solutions, and we've delivered something in excess of 1,000 penetration tests across a wide range of disciplines to a wide range of clients and customers. I'm its chief executive. I'm the chief executive of GRC International, which is the holding company for IT governance. We're an AIM listed company. I set the business up some 15 or so years ago to be a single source for organizations who wanted to be able to address cybersecurity without needing themselves to become experts on how to deal with it. They simply want to have the matter sorted so they can get on with running their business. And today I'm going to talk about security testing, briefly why organizations need it. We'll have a look at a headline cyber attack which made the headlines in July, what went wrong, how it could have been mitigated, how penetration testing can help reduce cyber risk, a look at the pros and cons of penetration testing, and a look at our own penetration testing solutions and how they can help you. This is designed to be a maximum 20-minute presentation. The slides and a recording will be available to everybody booked on it afterwards, and there will be a moment or two, with a bit of luck, available for questions at the end. So, security testing, often called penetration testing or pen testing, or sometimes ethical hacking. It's a systematic process of probing for vulnerabilities in networks and applications. It's essentially a controlled form of hacking. What we're doing is we're replicating what hackers would do. We are effectively people who are as good as hackers, just we have ethics. We believe in staying on the right side of the law, and we act on behalf of our clients to find and test weaknesses that criminals could find and exploit, weaknesses such as inadequate or improper configurations in websites, web applications, internet-facing systems, and internally on systems which can be accessed by people already on your systems. We look for known and unknown hardware and software flaws. Known we can plan for, unknown show up because we can find a way of exploiting something. And we look for operational weaknesses in your processes or in your technical countermeasures. What we're trying to do in a controlled way is to identify the ways in which criminals will attack you, and to find and document your vulnerabilities so that we can tell you about them in a way that enables you then to remediate them. So if you come to us for a penetration test, we'll deploy an experienced penetration tester who will mimic the techniques all the way through. We study what attackers do, and we'll make sure that in mimicking those techniques, we don't actually damage your website. We won't deploy code that is malicious. We will simply identify the ways in which an attack could be successful. Penetration tests can, of course, be conducted outside business hours or when your networks and applications are at minimal usage, which means that that can minimize the impacts on everyday operations. Having somebody hard at work fiddling around on your website can sometimes impact traffic, especially on high-value volume websites. So we build that understanding into how we put a relationship together with you to make sure that we don't disrupt what is happening on your website in normal, proper ways. At the end of the testing, we'll pull together everything that we found, and we'll give you a report that details vulnerabilities we found, and we'll give you mitigation advice, what to do to deal with them. And we'll give you a report which is a combination of a nice, clear executive summary, which is written so that management can understand it. You can understand what the risks and rewards are, and we'll give you a technical annex which identifies specifically what each of the vulnerabilities is, with specific guidance on how to mitigate or remediate each of those vulnerabilities. And we'll give you those vulnerabilities classified all the way down from serious or critical to minor. Critical you want to worry about instantly, serious a bit longer, minor you might not worry about immediately because typically minor is unlikely to be exploited. But you'll get a nice clear report from us that enables you to determine what you want to do about the identified vulnerabilities. Penetration testing really has three broad types of testing. The first is an external test. An external test is the one which is carried out most frequently. The test is an examination of internet-facing infrastructure, web applications, websites. It's looking for vulnerabilities that anybody who is operating on the internet who finds your firewall or your website or web application might be able to exploit. And it will examine those, see whether we can gain access to the network, find out what other vulnerabilities there might be that could be exploited, and will produce that information for you. In addition to an external test, we can do an internal test. The fact that you're secure on the outside from people getting into the organization doesn't stop somebody who's inside the organization accessing assets and intellectual property which they shouldn't touch, doesn't stop people downloading and stealing data, doesn't stop people corrupting what you've got internally. And of course, the benefit of combining an external test and an internal test is that we're able to identify the depth of your defenses, how resilient your defenses are. It's not unknown for an attacker, once they've got through your first level defenses, to be able to exploit internal weaknesses, to escalate privileges, to move around inside your network, to identify data and access the data, and then exfiltrate the data and get it out. So having a network which is secure both to external attackers as well as secure internally is your most sensible position to be. In addition, we do social engineering testing, social testing. As organizations get their technical defenses stronger, so it's easier and quicker for attackers to exploit human weaknesses and to deploy social engineering attacks. A phishing email is the most common form of a social engineering attack, designed to get what you might call the fuzzy firewall, the human being who can recognize, if properly trained, the difference between an attack and what's a genuine communication from a customer or member of staff. And if an attacker can exploit that, they can get onto the network a lot more quickly, sending an email which has got a link in it that looks as though it's genuine. Somebody clicks on the link and that downloads a whole lot of malware, which is able then to corrupt the system. Not just social engineering attacks, so somebody can get physical access to your network because your external physical perimeter is poor. We can get into your server room or into an IT room from which we can get access to your panel on the cloud, wherever it is. Any one of those physical weaknesses can also enable an attacker to get to grips with what's going on inside your network. So if you want to have a thorough piece of penetration testing done, you'll look at a combination of external testing, internal testing, and social engineering testing. At the very least, you look for phishing simulations that identify weaknesses in people's understanding of what phishing emails look like, of how to report them, of how to deal with them. And really, it's dealing with all of those issues that enables you to make yourself secure on a regular basis. Of course, you can't just do these tests once. The reality is that attacks evolve. So as ethical hackers, we evolve our tools and technology so that we can keep up to date with what attackers are doing. But vulnerabilities are also identified. And as new vulnerabilities are identified, so it becomes possible to attack and exploit an IP or an computer asset that couldn't be attacked 3 months ago, we might be able to get into now. So most sensible organizations will run a program of tests which will take place maybe quarterly, maybe half yearly, at the very least once a year, but typically between once every 3 months and once every 6 months, to make sure that vulnerabilities have been identified, patched, and that you're on top of them. So that's a kind of general introduction to the key areas that you should be thinking about. And I want to look at a cyber attack that made headlines in July of this year and how it could have been mitigated. It's an interesting attack because it really started back in January 2021. And it gives you a sense of the fact that most attacks are not something which simply happen today. They grow over time. So in January 2021, there were 4 zero-day vulnerabilities identified in Microsoft Exchange servers. Microsoft Exchange servers, the servers that enable organizations to operate email systems, and these were on-premise Exchange servers, so clouds of organizations that had not yet migrated to Office 365 or to email in the cloud. A zero-day vulnerability is something which Microsoft doesn't yet know about. The attacker has found a vulnerability by probing websites, by investigating code, has found a way to get into a website, and the vendor, Microsoft in this case, doesn't yet know about it, so they haven't been able to launch a patch. So in January 2021, Microsoft identified some suspicious attack activity in on-premise Microsoft Exchange servers. They started working on putting together a patch for it. By March 2021, nevertheless, this hack had affected some 30,000 US organizations, including local governments, and the malware which was downloaded through those 4 0 days has been discovered on over 2,000 machines belonging to businesses in the UK. The UK government in July, just last week, joined the US and others in pointing out the cyber attack was the work of Chinese state-sponsored hackers. So this attack tells you a number of things. It tells you, first of all, that attackers, yes, they look for unknown vulnerabilities, but once they've found them, they really exploit known vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities, if they're in a widely used piece of software, give attackers prolific opportunities to get into organizations. Microsoft Exchange Server, very widely used. So if you've got a vulnerability in Exchange Server, you're going to get hacked. What attackers do is they look for vulnerabilities. They don't look for you. They don't say we're going to go and attack everybody in the legal sector. They go and attack everybody who has those specific zero-day vulnerabilities, because they can search for them and they can then mount standard attacks which they know will be successful in exploiting those vulnerabilities. It also helps you recognize that nation-state attacks aren't just focused on other nation states. Nation states develop hacking capabilities. They share them with advanced persistent threat gangs, cyber gangs, people they can plausibly deny having anything to do with because they're definitely not part of the state cybersecurity apparatus. But it means that those deniable attackers can attack the assets, the systems of countries with whom China or Russia is in competition. And bear in mind that this isn't one-way traffic. The US, America, Australia all have their own cybersecurity organizations, all are involved in what's going on around the world all the time. So the blowback, the knock-on effect of nation states dealing with cyber attacks affects all organizations of all sizes. So what do you do to deal with that? The reality is that all organizations, as soon as a vulnerability is identified, should take immediate action to download and install patches. You might not know, because you might not be paying attention to details about which patches have been identified, which vulnerabilities have been identified. You use penetration testing to test your systems and find out what has been identified. And ongoing penetration testing ensures that your systems have been patched. And it's that enables you to identify vulnerabilities and implement controls to reduce risk. It's interesting that here we are in July, and there are still organizations suffering because they haven't yet patched this known set of vulnerabilities. Of course, it's not just the original attacker that knows about these vulnerabilities, because once a vulnerability is identified, it gets what's called a CVE number, and it's listed with a severity marking in the publicly available National Vulnerability Database. That's the US National Vulnerability Database. It's a publicly available record of all known vulnerabilities. It tells you what the vulnerability is. It tells you how the attacker can exploit the vulnerability. So as you see, the first of them identified in this is the last 20 identified with their severity listed. It's currently listed as a high severity. It's a compromise that allows on Linux that allows a denial of service attack. A remote and unauthenticated attacker can disconnect a valid user session by connecting to an ephemeral port. Really good clue for an attacker. Attacker can probably download, either create their own exploit or download an exploit that will deal with that. This data is updated as soon as new information becomes available. And right now, today, the 30 most severe vulnerabilities include 16 which date from 2020 and prior. And that's 16 for which there are still known unpatched vulnerabilities in the wild. And the reason they get identified as being live is because organizations still have them. So the reality is that organizations, you may not know what software you have across, particularly in a complicated environment. You may not know what software you have and what vulnerabilities you have, but if you're deploying a regular penetration testing program, you can be sure that vulnerabilities are being identified. So the why conduct a penetration test? It's going to help you comply with regulations and standards such as PCI DSS, with the General Data Protection Regulation, which requires you to take appropriate steps taking account of the state of the art. It enables you, in response to a serious data breach on a similar organization, to make sure that you are not vulnerable. You should be able to ensure new applications or significant changes to business processes have not introduced new vulnerabilities you didn't know about. It enables you to manage the risks in outsourced services to make sure that organizations you're dealing with don't have vulnerabilities which an attacker could exploit to get into and use that organization to mount, for instance, a phishing attack against you. And enables you to have a practical, hands-on assessment of the risk of critical data systems being compromised. Enables you as directors and senior managers to meet your obligations to stay on top of emerging risks. For all organizations, Cyber Essentials certification is kind of the basic starting point, because that makes sure that at least once a year you've tested your infrastructure, your secure configurations, who has access to data and systems, that you're protecting malware and devices are being kept up to date. Cyber Essentials tests all of those. Those are your first steps to solid security. If you've made sure you're doing cybersecurity, Cyber Essentials annually, certifying annually, you've got a solid base for continuing penetration testing on a quarterly, biannual or annual basis. And so really just to look then at the pros and cons of penetration testing. Penetration testing will identify vulnerabilities as they emerge in your internet-facing and internal computer assets. They'll identify high-risk vulnerabilities that result from a combination of smaller vulnerabilities, because experienced pen testers can identify those, and will give you specific remediation advice. Of course, there are, from users' point of view, customers' point of view, some potential cons. If they're not done right, they can create a lot of damage. So you should only use CREST-registered penetration testers who've got substantial professional indemnity insurance. You have to trust the penetration tester. Of course you do. So you want to make sure you're dealing with an organization that has a track record of only employing ethical penetration testers in an ethical environment with a solid track record of delivering that kind of testing. And you want to ensure that testers are testing in realistic environments, because otherwise the results will be misleading. You can't test in a test environment because hackers are seeing your assets in the live environment. So testing has to take place in the live environment to make sure that the transition from test or staging to live hasn't revealed vulnerabilities which need to be dealt with. So the offer that we have deals with all of your potential needs. We can test network infrastructure, we can test web applications, we can also test the remote access that home-based users might have to your networks and systems. We can do simulated phishing attacks. Each of those links, and you can find those directly on our website, or you can go to, when we get the slides, you can follow through on those. You can see our range of certifications, and of course you can see the range of packages that, as a starting point, we have available for everybody who wants to be able to start with Cyber Essentials if you haven't already. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is a brief walk through the pros and cons of penetration testing, the why you should be doing penetration testing on a very regular basis. And we have a couple of minutes if you would like to ask any immediate questions. Please do unmute yourself or type into the chat box if you have any specific questions you want to ask. So in that case, on the basis that I don't see any questions, I'm going to say thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found it useful. As I said, we'll share the slides and recording to everybody over the course of the next day or so. So thank you all. I hope you have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.